Welcome to the Israel-Palestine Report. Typically on Saturday evening or Sunday, I upload the weekly updates on what has happened in the last week in the region, and specifically looking lately on the Israel-Hamas War in the Gaza Strip. Today, I decided to go live and actually take a lot of questions with regards to what has been happening in the war. It has been a very, very monumental week. What we have seen in the war in the last week is a truce that is theoretically indefinite. Theoretically, we're going to talk about that as far as we are concerned. The war is actually over. We have also seen the return of all the living hostages from the Gaza Strip. We are seeing the remaining hostages, bodies of hostages that are held in the Gaza Strip. We're going to talk about that. And also there's a lot of talk about the further implementation of what is going to happen in the next phases of the deal and the Trump plan. Is the war actually over? Is the Israeli military going to continue to withdraw? What is actually happening in the Gaza Strip, as there are a lot of reports that Hamas is meanwhile regaining power, regaining control, reasserting its authority, and fighting with militias in order to regain its hold in the Gaza Strip. So with that, thank you to everyone who has joined so far. We're going to start diving in a few minutes. For those of you who this is their first time, my name is Alon Burstein. I'm a professor of political science and an Israel Institute fellow at Tufts University. What we do in the Israel-Palestine Report is we talk about what are the regional developments and how they relate to this arena, Israel and Palestine. We talk about the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Hamas, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Yemen, all of the various things, and how they end up relating to what is happening in the current arena. Thank you, everyone who has joined so far. A couple of technical things that I'm going to say. I've received a lot of comments and questions from people that have said, when am I going to do these live performances, and can I schedule them in advance? So, moment of, like I say, full disclosure, I have two little kids. One of them is 3 years old. One of them is 10 months old. Therefore, my ability to sometimes say, I know I'm going to be on at this hour, and this hour is relatively limited. That is contingent on when the kids go to sleep and how much I can actually then facilitate going online. With that, I will say that in the coming weeks, I am planning to actually set up a newsletter. It will be a way for me to actually send out email blasts or text messages. I'm going to figure out what the right technical way to do this is. And that way I'll be able to actually let you know when I'm planning to go on lives. You can come on with your questions. And also, if you have any specific questions you want me to cover in these various reports, you can also feel free to then shoot me back emails and we can talk about it then. Hi to everyone who is joining. I'm seeing a lot of messages of people coming in. I'm going to give it another minute or two, and then I'm going to actually dive in. If there are, thank you to people that are saying there's no need to explain to the reason why I can't let you know about lives in advance. Thank you. However, at the same time, thank you, Carv Lewis. I need a global bat signal. You know what? I have someone who is helping me. His name is Belik. He's helping me to develop this YouTube channel. I will ask him about this global bat signal and figure out how we can arrange such a thing. Until then, it'll probably be some form of a newsletter. So with that, I'm going to give another minute or two as I see people are still signing on. And then I'm going to start diving in. What I'm going to do, again, today is give my weekly summary that usually I would pre-record and then upload. I'm going to talk a lot about what has happened in the past week. I'm going to talk about the various developments of the deal that is theoretically still continuing and where things are stuck and possibly where we go from here. And again, we'll be happy to field any questions to the best of my ability. So with that, I'm taking a small break. Floodland asks, could settlers in the West Bank ever be disarmed? Today, to be honest, I'm not going to talk that much about the West Bank. I will say that the settlers in the West Bank, a lot of them are armed for two reasons. One, legally I'm talking about, not talking about the moral, justified, not justified. Everyone who watches me knows I don't deal with that. One of the reasons that a lot of times the settlers are armed from a legal perspective is because, according to Israeli law, if you live beyond the Green Line, that is, if you live in the West Bank or prior to 2005 in the Gaza Strip and you are an Israeli citizen, you are entitled to a weapon. Another one is a lot of them actually serve either in the Israeli military or in cooperation with the Israeli military. So for them to be disarmed, they would actually need to change the law in Israel such that that would be illegal, because most of the weaponry that Israeli settlers have in the West Bank is actually legal weaponry, as opposed to the weaponry of Palestinians, which is technically illegal and thus much more easy, so to speak, to confiscate. So with that, and I apologize, I'm going to be looking at, because this is my weekly summary, I'm going to be looking at a couple of printouts that I have in order to just make sure that I touch on all the topics that I wanted to touch on today. What am I going to be talking about? I'm going to start from reviewing the past week and the implementation of the Trump deal. And then I'm going to talk about what is going on in the Gaza Strip. People are asking me to stop apologizing. It's in my nature. I was about to say it's in my nature. I apologize. It's in my nature to apologize a lot. I hope you forgive me. How about that one? So I'm going to start talking about the implementation of the deal in the Gaza Strip. What is happening as far as phase one? What does phase two include when it comes to the deal? And then I'm going to talk about what is actually happening in the Gaza Strip on the ground. Because while these deals, this is something that's often being missed, I think, while these deals are being negotiated in Egypt, in Qatar, with the United States, with Turkey, meanwhile, in the Gaza Strip, a lot of things are developing on the ground that do not exactly match up to how the deal is supposed to be. So I'm going to start talking about what's happening in the deal, and then talk about what is happening in the Gaza Strip. And again, I'll pause to look at the chat and the questions at various different times. One thing that I'm going to ask people, if you have a question, and I see some have already done that, please preface it with question, so that I know it's not just the quote-unquote regular chat, but actually a question that I should address. So, what has happened? Just as a reminder, in the last week, we have had the monumental breakthrough when it comes to the agreements between the sides and a possible truce and ceasefire and maybe an end to the war. And that has been the implementation of the first phase of Trump's 20-point plan. Anyone who has been watching me in the past week, and I've uploaded a lot of videos, live streams, and interviews in the past week, has heard me say many times that Trump's 20-point plan should not be understood as a plan. It should be understood as a framework. It should be understood as a vision. It's something that is very broad, looking at how the war in Gaza should end, and according to Trump, how the war in the Middle East should end. All the Middle East is going to have peace by the end of this plan. It's not a concrete implementation plan as to how things happen on the ground. And that is the reason why, even if all sides have theoretically agreed to the 20-point plan, that cannot be implemented. It requires actual negotiation over each phase in order to figure out how exactly that is going to then play out on the ground. And again, as I'm going to talk about, or how it's not playing out on the ground. So the first phase of the plan, that is what theoretically was supposed to be implemented this week. Large parts of it have been implemented. Some parts of it have not been implemented. What does the first phase of the deal include? The first phase of the deal included the release of all Israeli hostages, living and dead, and in exchange, the release of Palestinian prisoners and the return of bodies of Palestinians that are held by Israel, a truce and an IDF redeployment, the redeployment of the Israeli military in the Gaza Strip to what has become known as the Yellow Line. And I'm going to talk about that, but that is a line that is roughly along this area over here that essentially leaves this area, half of Han Yunis, not Rafah, but half of Han Yunis, the central parts of Gaza, and large parts of Gaza City not under Israeli control, but all of the perimeter areas and all of Rafah and half of Han Yunis under the control of the Israeli military, so a redeployment. A substantial increase in humanitarian aid that comes into the Gaza Strip, and the opening of the Rafah crossing for the evacuation of injured Palestinians, and some interpret that also as the return of Palestinians into Gaza. Some say it's only in phase two. So, what actually happened with regards to the implementation of phase one? It was agreed upon last week, Friday. On October 10th, the truce went into effect in Israel on Friday at 1:20 a.m. on October 10th. And by Saturday, October 11th, exactly a week ago, the Israeli military completed its redeployment to that famous Yellow Line that has now become famous in the Gaza Strip. So the Israeli military pulled back, and that started the 72-hour clock that after that, the Israeli hostages were supposed to be released. Then there was also a substantial increase of humanitarian aid that started to come into the Gaza Strip, upwards of 600 aid trucks coming in per day. And on Monday, October 13th, Monday of this past week, that was the big day, so to speak. That is when US President Trump came to Israel to speak and then flew to Egypt, to Sharm el-Sheikh, where we had the big peace conference where it was declared, again, there's going to be peace in the Middle East. All the sides are going to work together. On that same Monday of this past week, on October 13th, in fact, all of the living Israeli hostages in the Gaza Strip, 20 remaining living hostages, were released. So there's no more Israeli hostages that are living held in the Gaza Strip. And in exchange, Israel released close to 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. Roughly 1,700 of them were Palestinians that were arrested during the war in Gaza. And even calling them prisoners is a bit questionable because they were not actually ever brought to trial because there's no legal framework to actually try them. So they were detainees by Israel. Another 250 were Palestinians who were sentenced to life prison in Israeli jails. Usually that means that they were either the leaders of terror organizations or that they were responsible for a lot of different Palestinian attacks. And then there were another, give or take, 60 or 70 that were women or minors who were held in Israeli jails. They were all released by Israel in exchange for the 20 live hostages that were released. Hamas, according to the deal, was also supposed to return the bodies of 28 hostages that were held in the Gaza Strip. These include hostages that were people that were killed on October 7th and their body was kidnapped back to the Gaza Strip, as well as hostages that were kidnapped alive and were killed in captivity, either executed by Hamas or that were killed by the Israeli military during the fighting. That part, the return of the bodies of hostages, did not happen. As far as the bodies of hostages are considered, there were 28 hostages that were held, 28 bodies that are held by Hamas. Of those 28, Hamas returned 4 of the bodies on Monday, October 13th, and then Hamas started to say that it has a problem. It said, first of all, it does not know the location of between 8 to 10 of the bodies. It said within all of the fighting and all the rubble, all the bombings in Gaza, it does not know the location of between 8 to 10 of the bodies. 1. 2, it said, and even the bodies that it does know the location of, they are buried under the rubble. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the situation in the Gaza Strip and the mass amounts of rubble that is in the Gaza Strip as a result of the fact that the vast majority of the Strip has been bombed and basically razed to the ground. Hamas has said it requires heavy industrial equipment to get to the bodies. Israel rejected this and said no. According to its intelligence, Hamas can get to a large majority of the bodies. And thus, what we had was a situation since Monday when Hamas is saying that it has a minimal amount of tractors and heavy equipment and it can get to some of the bodies, but it's going to take time. Israel has been saying, no, it needs to do this faster, and Israel's not going to continue with phase 1 until the bodies are returned. Since then, Hamas has returned on the next day, on October 14th. They returned 4 more bodies. However, only 3 of them were of Israeli hostages. One of them was actually of a Palestinian who was a known collaborator with the Israeli military. And interestingly, he was returned wearing an IDF uniform. He was from actually the West Bank. I'm not going to get into that now. It's very interesting to people like me who study the conflict, the identity of those Palestinian quote-unquote collaborators. But for all intents and purposes, as far as the bodies of hostages, 3 more were returned the following day. Since then, there have been more and more reports that Hamas is trying to excavate in the Gaza Strip in order to dig up the bodies of hostages that may be buried under the rubble or in tunnels. Al Jazeera published a lot of footage of the tractors that are working in Khan Yunis and in the areas of Gaza City in order to try to actually show that Hamas is looking for those bodies. And since then, I will say, Hamas has returned 1 more body that happened on Thursday, and then today, on October 18th, 2 more bodies have been returned. Those have not been identified yet, but they are presumably of Israeli hostages. Thus, since the deal went through, Hamas has returned the bodies of 12 hostages out of the 28. Again, assuming that the 2 that were returned today, they're still being identified in Israel. Assuming that the 2 that were returned today are in fact of Israeli hostages, leaving currently still in the Gaza Strip 16 bodies of hostages that are held by Hamas. Again, Hamas says it only knows the location of some of them and can't get to them. Israel is saying it knows the location of more. So, with regards to phase 1, what we have is the release of all living hostages and in turn the release of upwards of or close to 2,000 Palestinian prisoners, the return of 12 out of 28 bodies of hostages, and Israel in turn returned an amount of Palestinian bodies also that are held according to the deal. And we had the substantial increase of humanitarian aid, the idea for redeployment, and in fact, a truce has been declared in the Gaza Strip. With that, however, there's a lot of questions about the other facets of phase one, and specifically the opening of the Rafah crossing, because that was one of the things that was also part of phase one, and that has not been implemented yet. So what has happened with regards to the Rafah crossing? It was said at the beginning of the week that it's going to take time and that the sides still need to work out the mechanism, that Israel will have assurances that the crossing is not going to be open for the smuggling in of weaponry. Some said that it's going to involve the Palestinian Authority, and some said it's going to involve the EU. Israel said it's not going to involve either, and a lot of sides were saying different things. On October 15th, the Egyptian governor of Northern Sinai said that the Palestinian Authority and the EU would operate the Rafah crossing from the Gazan side, which I will say makes sense in terms of history, because that was the deal that was arranged in 2005 when Israel put out of the West Bank. It was going to be the Palestinian Authority and the EU. So to some extent, it makes sense that they would just fall back to that deal. In Israel, that would be very politically damaging to the government if they allowed the Palestinian Authority to actually come in and operate the Rafah crossing. And therefore, very, very quickly in Israel, this was denied. And it was said that no, it's going to be local Palestinians from Gaza that aren't actually part of the Palestinian Authority. Honestly, I assume that it is part of the Palestinian Authority, but again, it hasn't happened yet. Then, on October 18th, on the day that I'm recording this, the Palestinian embassy in Egypt announced that the Rafah crossing is going to open as of Monday, but in Israel, this was very quickly denied. In Israel, the Prime Minister's office put out a statement saying, until all the bodies of hostages are returned, Israel is not going to allow the opening of the Rafah crossing. And Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu then put out a second statement saying that Hamas is violating the first phase of the deal by not returning all the bodies, and therefore Israel is going to make the opening of the Rafah crossing contingent on Hamas living up to its side of the deal. Alongside this current stalemate, throughout the week, Israel also threatened that it was going to stop the entrance of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. It was going to have it. Instead of it being 600 aid trucks coming in a day, it would be 300 aid trucks coming in a day because Hamas is violating the deal. Seemingly, Israel came under a lot of pressure from the United States because very quickly, within several hours, Israel backtracked on that and said, actually, no, they're not going to do that. So I do expect that if the Rafah crossing is in fact prepared to be open logistically between the Palestinian side and the Egyptian side, that Israel is probably going to find a way to be okay with that. As of now, though, the official statements are Palestinian side and Egyptian side are saying it's going to open on Monday. Israeli side saying, no, it's not. What we have in the meantime is a lot of pressure that is being reported from the United States, saying that as far as the United States is concerned, and this was reported in a CNN article on October 15th, the two senior U.S. officials that are close to the Trump administration were quoted as saying that as far as the U.S. is concerned, Hamas is not actually violating the deal because it is actually doing its part to try to return the bodies of hostages. And therefore, the United States would like to see the further implementation of phase one leading into phase two that we'll talk about in a minute. And that's another reason why I do assume that regardless of how many hostages or the bodies of hostages are actually returned, we are going to see the opening of the Rafah crossing. Again, that's an assumption on my part, but reading what has happened over the last week, Israel has several times, when it came to the opening of the crossing, when it came to the entrance of humanitarian aid, when it came to a couple of different things, Israel has said, well, they're going to stop the deal as far as they're concerned because Hamas is violating it. The United States stepped in, and Israel quickly backtracked on that. So that's my assumption when it comes to the Rafah crossing. I'm taking a break now because that is the end of phase one of the deal. So I'm going to go back and look at a few questions. Why would they allow Hamas to perform security duties when you know weapons will be involved? I'm going to talk in a minute. Thank you to Warrior for that question. I'm going to talk in a minute, or not in a minute. After I talk about phase two, we're going to talk about what Hamas is doing on the ground. So if I don't address that question, please ask it again. Other questions. Likelihood of the yellow line current demarcation freezes into permanence. Again, Carbulus, thank you. I'm going to talk about the situation in the Gaza Strip very soon. Some are saying that the yellow line, again, reports on the yellow line. Someone is asking, please just tell us which side you think has the moral upper hand. I wonder if this is one of my students who asked that, because my students often ask me about my political opinion, and I always say I do not deal in morality. I do not deal in political opinions. I am an academic studying the conflict. Therefore, I do not bring my own judgment as to which side is which. I obviously have an opinion, but I try not to bring it, so I hope that that is in fact coming through. How close is the relationship between the U.S. and Israel? Trump called Bibi difficult to deal with in the Knesset. What's the relationship like, Nate asks. Largely historically, the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump has gone up and down. Seemingly that both of them right now are, on the one hand, acting as though their relationship is very close. On the other hand, as far as the way Trump is behaving, I would argue that the relationship now is actually at a down. There's a lot of reports that Trump is extremely angry with Netanyahu over the way Israel carried out the war, and specifically over the assassination attempt of the Hamas leadership in Qatar. And if I look at the way Trump has handled this deal, the fact that he proposed it first to a group of Arab and Muslim countries in the United Nations before even coordinating it with Israel, the fact that Trump went to a regional peace conference attended by 31 countries, including countries like Iraq, Turkey, Pakistan, Indonesia, and also inviting Iran even, but Israel was not part of it. Trump did not bring Netanyahu there as my buddy. Israel was not part of it. That tells me that even though they're both constantly praising each other and talking as though things between them are very good, in fact, the relationship right now is likely not that good. Other questions I'm looking at: any provision in agreement to remove such ordinance by Israel-Arab soldiers? I'm going to talk a little bit about the interests of Arab soldiers in a minute. Did Hamas declare the difficulty of retrieving the deceased hostages before signing the agreement? That's a good question. Carbulis asks, did Hamas declare the difficulty in retrieving deceased hostages before signing the agreement, i.e., did they say this was going to be a holdup in advance, or did they only say this after? There were rumors, and this was not from Hamas, but actually more from Qatar, that the return of bodies was going to be challenging, and they didn't say that it would be hard to excavate them from underneath the rubble. They just said it is possible that Hamas does not even know where the bodies are, but no. Hamas, the first time that it said it does not know, the first time that officially Hamas said it does not know the location of some of the bodies was only on October 12th after the deal was signed. Other questions I am looking at. Question 17, I think I remember. I thought stated aid would be allowed whether Hamas agrees or not. So the question is about the interests of humanitarian aid. It is true that it was stated that the aid is going to go into the Gaza Strip regardless of the implementation of Phase 1. However, again, technically, Israel controls every single access to the Gaza Strip. It controls all of the land crossings, controls the airspace, controls the sea space. The sea entries. So, even though the deal technically says that, yes, all humanitarian aid will come in regardless of what happens, Israel still has to agree to that. What is the position of the 200 military personnel? I'll talk about that soon. Okay. And with that, I think I answered all the questions. You can feel free to ask it again if I missed a question. And with that, I'm going to go on to talking about Phase 2 of the agreement. So we have Phase 1. And again, Phase 1 is not complete. The glaring signs that are missing from Phase 1, and I'll talk a little bit about the ongoing fighting in the Gaza Strip at the end. The glaring aspects that are missing from the implementation of Phase 1 are the return of all the bodies of hostages, and in exchange, the return of the bodies of Palestinians that are held by Israel, and the opening of the Rafah crossing, mostly for the evacuation of injured Palestinians, but also for the return of Palestinians who want to return to Gaza. Again, some say that's only part of Phase 2, some not. That varies. So, then the question is, okay, let's say Phase 1 was complete. Let's say this happens, then what? The Israeli military currently sits on 58% of the Gaza Strip. Hamas is rebuilding in the other parts of the Gaza Strip, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Hamas is rebuilding in those areas. What happens next? What is Phase 2? And like I said, Trump's 20-point program platform should be thought of as a framework, not necessarily as a plan. So what happens next? What does Phase 2 involve? Phase 2 involves a wide range of things. It includes, among others, the establishment of an interim government in the Gaza Strip, a new governing body in the Gaza Strip that is going to be made up of technocrats from the different stratas of Palestinian society. So a government that's not affiliated specifically with any other faction, but also specifically not with Hamas. Hamas is not supposed to be part of that government. The development of an international stabilization force. That, in the plan, according to what Trump said, is supposed to be made up of a wide range of different militaries. It is going to involve maybe the United States, but more likely the armies of different Middle Eastern countries and Muslim countries. I'll talk about that in a minute, what we know about that thus far. The establishment of a board of peace that is going to oversee this, headed by Trump and possibly Tony Blair. There's also going to help with the establishment of the Palestinian police force in the Gaza Strip. The gradual withdrawal of the Israeli military from the Gaza Strip and handing over the territory to this international stabilization force. Hamas disarming, handing over its military. And Gaza demilitarizing. And it's important, and I'm emphasizing that those are two different things. Hamas disarming means the actual armed militants, operatives of Hamas lay down their weaponry. A demilitarization of the area means also confiscating that weaponry and destroying the weapons manufacturing capabilities and destroying the attack tunnels. So it's a much larger thing. So the two are involved in the phase two. Hamas disarming and Gaza demilitarizing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about, okay, so in the last week, what do we know about any negotiations with regards to this, and what is being ignored at this point? Firstly, during that peace conference that happened on Monday, Trump was asked, alongside Egyptian President Assisi, whether or not phase two is already being discussed, and he said yes, phase two is already being negotiated. I will say, very glaringly in that conference, the Palestinian Authority was invited. Israel was not invited. It was invited only several hours before the conference started and then ended up not coming. And Hamas was not invited, which again is understandable because Hamas is a designated terror organization. But therefore, negotiations over phase two and all of its implementation without the actual fighting sides would be challenging at best. However, throughout the week, we did have several reports that the negotiating countries are, in fact, in the process of discussing the implementation of phase two, among others, with regards to the interim government, the establishment of a new governing body in the Gaza Strip. And again, I'm going to talk in a minute about what's actually happened on the ground. But as far as the implementation of phase two, on October 14th, AP quoted the Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr al-Atni, who said that a committee of 15 Palestinian delegates who are going to be technocrats, again, not affiliated with any specific faction, has been selected. He said that all the different Palestinian factions, including Hamas, all the different Palestinian factions submitted their proposals for who would make up this delegation. 15 technocrats have been selected, and they, as far as the negotiating countries are concerned, are supposed to make up the interim governing body in the Gaza Strip. That list, according to AP, has now been submitted to Israel on October 14th in order to review, because Israel theoretically has to approve who's going to be this interim government. I will say that's the last I heard about it. I monitor Israeli news, Palestinian news, regional news, international news. I have not seen any reports about Israel accepting this list, reviewing it, seeing it. It is very likely that Israel did receive that list and is looking at it. But at this point, given that the identity of those 15 Palestinians who are supposed to make up this interim government has not been exposed, I actually have absolutely no prediction as to if Israel is going to agree to it or not agree to it, who it includes. Scores of rumors have spread throughout the media and social media. Some have said that it probably includes Salam Fayyad, some have said Mohammed Ahlan, others have said other figures that are associated with Hamas or the Popular Front of Liberation of Palestine or Fatah or the PLO. But it's all rumors. It's all unsubstantiated rumors at this point. So at this point, what we know, again, according to AP and quoting the Egyptian foreign minister, that list has been submitted, but we have no actual knowledge as to if Israel is going to agree, what the chances are that Israel is going to agree, or if this is actually going to be implemented. So as far as phase two, the development of an interim government in the Gaza Strip, that's as far as we go. Throughout the week, theoretically, such a list was established and given to Israel. With regards to the establishment of the International Stabilization Force, again, this is supposed to be a military force that is going to assume control over different parts of the Gaza Strip after the Israeli military withdraws. And again, within Trump's 20-point plan, it's extremely vague how that happens. Trump's 20-point plan says the Israeli military will withdraw from areas once they are considered to be terror-free, free of terror, and will hand it over to the International Stabilization Force. It doesn't say who decides that. Does Israel have to say they're free of terror? Does Hamas say they're free of terror? It also doesn't say who gets to veto who is part of this International Stabilization Force and who is not. But that said, with regards to the establishment of this force and the establishment of a Palestinian police force, again, on October 14th, so a day after the peace conference, it was reported in the United States that Israel and Hamas are already negotiating the implementation of phase 2 with regards to the deployment of this new force, and that they're already discussing how 1,000 Palestinian police officers will be deployed to the Gaza Strip. According to that report, they have been trained by Egypt and Jordan over the last several months, and they're going to be deployed in the Gaza Strip. I will say to those who say, wait a minute, this is only a week old, why several months? There have been reports, and I've said this in my reports weekly, there have been reports here and there over the last months that Egypt and Jordan are in fact training Palestinian police officers to one day be deployed in Gaza. So according to the United States, again, on October 14th, it was reported that Israel and Hamas are already negotiating the development of that stabilization force and the Palestinian police force. Several hours later, after that report came out, Israel's Channel 14, which I will say is a news outlet that is heavily affiliated with Netanyahu himself, Israel's Channel 14 published quotes from a senior source, which is usually the prime minister, stating that that report in the United States is not true, that Israel is not actually negotiating with Hamas over phase 2, and that the only talks that are happening are about the return of the bodies of hostages. So, again, it depends at this point, who do you believe? As someone said before, so tell me your opinion. I'm not going to give my own opinion. I will say that it is far more likely that the United States is reporting that there are ongoing negotiations. There are negotiations happening between Israel and at least the negotiating sides. Are those negotiations actually about the actual implementation of the Palestinian police force or not? Likely the sides are both right. So to some extent, it is possible they're negotiating how that police force is going to be implemented after the bodies are returned. So Israel is saying, no, we're only talking about the bodies returning, and then later we'll talk about that. And the other side is saying, no, we're already talking about that. Don't know. What is for sure is that this hasn't been forgotten, as opposed to, again, some sides of the 20-point plan. This doesn't seem to have been forgotten. Strengthening that also is another report that came in today, October 18th, that said that there's already advanced negotiations with international actors on who's going to make up that international stabilization force. And that, according to, again, the different reports, that force is going to be led by Egypt, which makes a lot of sense because Egypt has ground access and a lot of cultural ties, etc., to the Gaza Strip. But then in addition to that, the International Stabilization Force is going to be made up of troops from Turkey, Indonesia, and Azerbaijan. It also said in a different report that that International Stabilization Force is going to have UN peacekeepers and will receive a mandate from the United Nations itself in order to be able to execute its security operations in the Gaza Strip. So again, what we have with regards to phase 2 and the implementation of the International Stabilization Force, we have that report from October 14th that the sides are already discussing this and then in denial from Israel. And then we have a report from October 18th saying that there's already advanced negotiations with the militaries of Egypt, Turkey, Indonesia, and Azerbaijan. And I'll say also that that may make sense to some extent because Azerbaijan has close military ties to Israel. Turkey used to have close military ties to Israel. It's gone down in recent years, but possibly will be resumed. Indonesia has been holding a lot of back-channel negotiations with Israel over the last several months about possible normalization and developing ties between the countries, so that may also be. All that may be happening in Israel. There was no comment about those reports of the identity of those armies. Again, all I'm saying now is, first of all, as you're probably reading through the lines, We don't actually know what is being negotiated and what is not, but there are enough reports that are coming through that suggest that something is happening. It's not like the sides are not actually discussing at all. Something is happening with regards to the negotiations on the National Stabilization Force and the deployment of Palestinian police officers. Maybe the sides are already in advanced negotiations, maybe they're not, but something is happening with regards to how the mediators are talking about this. I'm going to talk about two more aspects of phase two, and then I'm going to pause for questions before I talk about what has been happening in the Gaza Strip. With regards to the other aspects of phase two, and the biggest one that a lot of people are asking about is Hamas disarming. Will Hamas actually disarm? So I'm going to talk again a little bit later about what Hamas has been doing in the Gaza Strip. But in terms of what has been published over the last week, we've had a slew of conflicting reports with regard to what is Hamas's position on this. Some have said that Hamas categorically rejects the idea of disarming. It's not going to disarm. Many different Hamas leaders have been quoted as saying that they are not going to disarm as long as the Israeli occupation exists. A lot of others have said they're not going to disarm as long as there's no Palestinian state. What is for sure is there is a slew of reports that say Hamas will simply refuse to disarm. Others, and especially reports coming out from the mediating countries in Egypt and Qatar, have said Hamas would be willing to hand over its weaponry, but only to a Palestinian force. So it would not be willing to hand over its weaponry, obviously not to Israel, but certainly, but what the report says, also not to an international stabilization force or possibly to a different military. If there is an established Palestinian government, then maybe Hamas would be willing to hand over its weaponry to them. And further reports said that if a Palestinian state is established, Hamas would be willing to hand over its weaponry to a Palestinian military. All those reports happened over the last week, which again put us in the position that we don't actually know what Hamas's position is on this. And I'll say even more likely, Hamas does not have an established position on this right now. There's probably different opinions within the military wing in the Gaza Strip that is headed by Izzadin Haddad and the external leadership, including Khalil Haya, Khalid Mashal, and others that are much more political figures. There's probably different opinions about this. Very likely right now, Hamas does not have an established opinion on this. So anyone who's asking, will Hamas disarm or not? Factually, we do not know at this point. A larger question, however, is how much will this be insisted upon by Trump and Israel and the negotiating countries? When it came to, for example, the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon with regards to the fighting with Hezbollah, Israel and the United States have been adamant that the Lebanese military proceed in disarming Hezbollah, and that has happened. That has largely happened. The Lebanese military has been deploying in southern Lebanon. It has been actively taking out a lot of Hezbollah infrastructure and confiscating weaponry. I'm not saying that the process is complete, that Hezbollah is no longer a threat to Israel or to the region and disarmed, far from it. But there's a lot of insistence that this is part of the deal, and Israel has in fact not withdrawn from Lebanon because that has not been completed. In turn, there's a lot of questions being raised. Is Trump going to actually insist that Hamas needs to disarm? And if it does not, is Trump going to allow Israel to return to fighting or not? Or is Trump going to say, well, the fighting has stopped and Hamas maybe is promising to not fight anymore, so maybe that'll be enough and have no more return to fighting? That's going to be the bigger question. If Hamas disarms or not, even if Hamas says that they're going to disarm, that's going to be something that takes several months, maybe years. The bigger question is going to be if Trump, and therefore Israel, but for all intents and purposes Trump, actually insists that this is part of the deal or not, and if that means that there's a return to fighting or not. Trump himself published several contradictory messages about that over the last week. He said on October 14th that Hamas will disarm, and that if they do not, it will be done by others in a quick and violent move. But then 2 days later, he also said that Hamas promised the United States through mediators that they will disarm, and that it seems like they are prepared to do so. So on the one hand, Trump is saying there might be violence. On the other hand, he's saying, but it seems like Hamas is going to do that. At this point, unclear if he's going to insist on that or not. A last thing with regards to the, sorry, 1 second. A last thing with regards to the implementation of phase two is the question of, is Israel going to actually allow its implementation without the completion of phase one? And to that, I'm just going to say that on October 16th, it was reported, on the one hand, that Israel has given Hamas an ultimatum that it will not proceed with any negotiations or implementation of phase two if or unless the bodies of the hostages are returned. On the other hand, it was also reported that day that the United States, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, along with the commander of CENTCOM, Central Command, Brad Cooper, had a meeting with Israel's Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, and they conveyed that the United States would like to see the implementation of phase two, regardless of if Hamas completes the return of the bodies of hostages or not. So on the one hand, we have Israel saying that they're not going to continue. On the other hand, we have the United States, according to reports, pressuring Israel, saying it does want the continuation of phase two regardless. With that, I'm now going to pause and take a look at some of the questions before I go to talking about what is actually happening in the Gaza Strip at this point. So, sorry, there's a lot of quotes, a lot of comments here, so I'm going to try to see some of the questions. Again, if you have a question, please preface it with the word question. Looking at some of these, forgive me, I'm a slow reader. Intentionally advantageous for Hamas to drag out phase one or all phases. So Krabuz asks, is it advantageous for Hamas to drag out phase one? At this point, I'll say it likely is advantageous for Hamas to drag out phase one, because even though the Rafah crossing is closed, at this point, Hamas wants to create a situation where de facto Israel cannot return to fighting. And the longer there is no fighting, the more it is likely, without living hostages in the Gaza Strip, the more it is likely that Trump is going to say, why are you returning to fighting? Okay, Hamas still has some weaponry out there. Why are you returning to fighting? So very likely, at this point, it is advantageous for Hamas to not actually implement the full mechanisms of phase one and drag it out. Other question. If Israel's strike was successful in Qatar, do I think there would have been a different scenario? Very difficult to say, because if Israel's strike in Qatar had been successful, then the Hamas external leadership would have been wiped out. At that point, we would have had a power vacuum within Hamas. The only real leader would have been the militant leader in the Gaza Strip, the leader of the Al-Qassam brigades, Ezzeddin Haddad. And at that point, likely would have had actually a more militant response, because all the external leadership of Hamas in Qatar is a political leadership. He's a militant leader. He grew up within the Al-Qassam brigades, so possibly would have had a different trajectory that would have been increase in fighting. But again, that's speculation on my part. Other questions. Do we know how strong Hamas's military fighting power is today? I'm going to address that in a minute. Do I think Prime Minister Netanyahu will get a pardon if President Trump's recommendation? So I know a lot of people asked about the fact that Trump suggested to Israel's president to pardon Netanyahu. I will say very briefly, because it's not what I'm talking about now, that is not technically possible. In Israel, the pardon system, the president does have that power, but he only has that power if a person is found guilty and expresses remorse. You cannot pardon someone for a crime that they are claiming innocence to. So even if President Herzog wanted to pardon Netanyahu, for that Netanyahu would have to plead guilty. And Netanyahu right now is pleading innocent, and therefore, even if that was possible, even if the president wanted to do that, it would not be technically possible. When it comes to this question, I mean, Dean ex Al Qaeda. Okay, I'm not going to field questions about that at this point. I'm sorry. Feel free to email me that. According to the Trump plan, what is the goal and the duties of the International Stabilization Force and the Palestinian Police Force? Are they different bodies? Excellent question. Hammer 122 asks, what are the goals of the International Stabilization Force and of the Palestinian Police Force? First of all, yes, they are supposed to be different bodies. What their goals are in the 20-point plan is not specified. The Palestinian Police Force is supposed to worry about security, internal security in the Gaza Strip, to have a police force, to not have a power vacuum. The role of the International Stabilization Force is not specified. Theoretically, it's supposed to take control of the areas that the Israeli military withdraws from. So hypothetically, it would be to provide security for Israel as a military to stop terror activity. I don't know if, therefore, Trump expects troops from Indonesia and peacekeepers to fire on Hamas if they're about to fire a rocket. That didn't work well when it came to the UNIFIL force in southern Lebanon that was supposed to stop Hezbollah, but they didn't have a mandate to do that, so that didn't work. It's not clear. You ask a very accurate question. What will be the role of the International Stabilization Force? I do not have an answer because it is not specified in the 20-point plan. That is one of those things that theoretically would have to be negotiated between the sides about the implementation of phase 2. Other questions I'm looking at very, very quickly. Sorry, my mouse just skipped down. Someone's saying, pardon the question. Please do not apologize for questions. Okay, I think I filled all the questions up until now. Again, is there any group named that Hamas would give the weapons to, that Hamas would be willing to give the weapons to? So no, there's no specific group that Hamas has said they are willing to give their weaponry to. Hamas has said, in some elements of Hamas, have said that they're willing to give up their weapons to a Palestinian government. Is that the Palestinian Authority? Is that only after a Palestinian state? It's unclear. It is very unclear at this point who they are going to be willing to give up their weaponry to, and if they would even be willing to give up their weaponry at any point. With that, because I'm trying to keep this under an hour and I have 15 minutes left, I am now going to look at what is actually happening in the Gaza Strip over the last week. What is the situation on the ground, and how does this impact possibly the implementation of phase 2? When it comes to what's happening in the Gaza Strip, and again, I'm not talking about the interest of humanitarian aid, I talked about that. I'm going to talk about 3 specific things. One is Hamas, its deploying of its troops and its current strength. The other is the rebuilding efforts and how Hamas is also rebuilding its government. And the third is the Israeli military and what is it doing on the ground. When it comes to Hamas and its deployment, immediately after, literally within the hour, that the Israeli military announced that it had redeployed its troops in the Gaza Strip and pulled back to that yellow line, Hamas very, very publicly sent out its militant force, some 7,000 troops, operatives, armed, to deploy throughout the Gaza Strip. In those areas, just over 40% of the Gaza Strip, like I said, in the central parts of Gaza, the Al-Wasi, the area of Deir al-Balah, as well as Gaza City, to deploy and say we are regaining control. That was not just a tactical thing of Hamas regaining control of the Palestinian territory. It was also a display of force. It was showing they're not defeated. They're still there. At that moment, Hamas started a campaign of hunting down who they considered to be collaborators, Palestinians who had cooperated with the Israeli military, and also fighting different Palestinian militias. I'm going to say here, I'm not going to talk a lot about Palestinian militias. I did do an extensive interview about those militias just 2 days ago, and I uploaded it to my channel. So if you're interested, you can look at the upload that I had. Excuse me 1 second. Okay. Sorry about that. Like I said, I do have 2 little kids. Sorry, I'm just told that one of them is up and creating a scene. So if you hear any echoes in the background, please forgive me about that. I'm going to take a moment to catch my breath on that before I return to talk about Gaza. Thank you to all the supportive comments. Those of you who either have kids or have experienced my videos already with the kids coming on. Okay, so reset there. In terms of Hamas's deployment of its militant force in the Gaza Strip, it deployed those 7,000 militant operatives already in the first hours that the Israeli military withdrew, and it then started to hunt down collaborators and militias. Like I said, if you want to actually look at a more in-depth analysis of who those militias are, then check out that interview. I talked for 20, 25 minutes about who they are, and what their role has been throughout the war. I will say also that that has come to a lot of international attention because very, very publicly, Hamas has been executing Palestinians in the Gaza Strip under charges that they are either collaborators with Israel, that they collaborated and facilitated Israel's military activity, or that they are warlords that have either taken over humanitarian aid or have been, setting up their own warlord-like areas in Rafah or in Han Yunis throughout this time. In regards to that, and I will say Hamas has been doing this very, very publicly in order to intimidate the Palestinian population. With regards to that, the United States, Trump issued several different statements throughout the week. At first, he was asked about this already on Monday or Tuesday, and he said that he is not bothered by the fact that Hamas is executing those Palestinians. In fact, he said they're taking care of criminal gangs, and by all means, and of course, he related this to fighting crime as far as he's concerned in the United States. Then, a day later, on October 15th, he said, after a lot of international pressure, he said that he is looking into this, that if Hamas is actually exceeding what it should be doing. By October 16th, Trump put out a message saying, and I quote, "If Hamas continues to kill people in Gaza, which was not part of the deal, we will have no choice but to go in and kill them. Thank you for your attention to this matter." And on October 18th, the United States put out another statement that Hamas is starting to hunt down Palestinians and that the United States is going to consider this a violation of the deal. So throughout the week, we've had a change in the the position of the United States that on the one hand, Trump said he doesn't care, then changed to no, he really does care. In addition to that, just talking about the deployment of the Palestinian militant force and the fact that they are gaining strength. Throughout the week, in addition to those 7,000 troops, we have seen more and more militant operatives of Hamas being deployed throughout the different areas. And there was also a report in Israel's Khan News Network on October 17th that Hamas has set up special units in order to comb the Gaza Strip and collect fallen bombs of the IDF that did not explode, weaponry that was left behind, ammunition that was left behind, all in order to continuously be rebuilding its militant strength in Gaza. In addition to that, and I say this in that interview as well, it was reported on October 16th that the Israeli military had delivered a lot of weaponry and money to the different Palestinian militias that it is supporting in the Gaza Strip, not Hamas, and that Hamas had taken over upwards of 45 pickup trucks and trucks of the Israeli military had given that were full of money, hundreds of guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, as well as heavy guns. So Hamas took over upwards of 45 of those pickup trucks that Israel had tried to deliver to the Palestinian factions and had given them to, and obviously had confiscated them for its own militant purposes. So that's in terms of Hamas's military rebuilding. In addition to that, what else is happening in the Gaza Strip? As far as the rebuilding of infrastructure, Hamas, in addition to rebuilding its military, has also gone on a campaign to rebuild its governing structure. Already a day after the Israeli military's redeployment, Hamas reported that it was appointing 5 new governors to administer the different parts of the Gaza Strip. And there are also reports that Hamas has been rebuilding its municipalities and starting to develop its civil administration in the Gaza Strip. So all this is happening. Meanwhile, alongside the rebuilding of its militant strength, Hamas is trying to essentially get back to the position it was on October 6th, where it had a militant wing armed to the teeth, as well as a civil administration. As part of this rebuilding, we have seen convoys of heavy equipment, tractors, that were sent by Qatar and by Egypt that have come into the Gaza Strip. It's a little bit questionable, I will say, how this happened, because Israel has said it's not opening the Rafah crossing to allow the Turkish forces or other heavy equipment to come in, yet there have been a lot of videos disseminated that I would say are pretty credible of tractors that have come in bearing Qatar's flag and bearing all kinds of other flags. So it's a little bit questionable as to how Israel allowed this to happen, but publicly Rafah crossing is closed. Nonetheless, what we do know is that there is a process, sort of an upswing of the rebuilding of the different infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, rebuilding hospitals, bakeries, clearing out the rubble from the different areas within the cities as part of Hamas trying to regain its control, because I'll say that's not all being done by Hamas. It's being done by international agencies. They're all in cooperation with Hamas. Hamas is the governing body in the Gaza Strip. So both those things are happening at the same time. We have a strengthening of the military wing of Hamas happening, and at the same time, we have also the civil administration, the clearing of rubble that is happening in the Gaza Strip, and the beginning of the rebuilding of infrastructure. Last thing I'll say about that, with regards to the rebuilding of infrastructure, the United Nations put out a report several days ago saying that it estimates that it will cost $70 billion in order to just clear the rubble and start rebuilding the infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. It also said that the EU, Canada, and the United States have pledged to give $70 billion. It didn't say who's giving what. It also said, this is just anecdotal, that the amount of rubble in the Gaza Strip is equivalent to 13 times the size of the pyramids in Egypt. That's just anecdotal, but just to give some sense of how much work is required in the Gaza Strip in order to actually rebuild that area. The last thing I'm going to say about what's happening in the Gaza Strip relates to the Israeli military. The Israeli military has withdrawn within the Gaza Strip to what's become known as the Yellow Line, and that is 58% of the Gaza Strip. Like I said, the Israeli military is now deployed from this line going up to Israel, everywhere along here, carving Han Yunis in half and going here. So all these areas, Rafah, half of Han Yunis, these areas of the perimeter, and then leading up to this area in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip are all still controlled by the Israeli military. Throughout the week, there have been several instances of airstrikes that the Israeli military carried out, primarily in the areas of Sajaiya up here. And there's also been other reports of airstrikes that were happened in the Abbasan region and artillery strikes that happened in the Al-Maghazi refugee camp in this area, near Al Bureij refugee camp. Different reports about what the Israeli military was doing, since theoretically a truce is in effect. And eventually it was reported that the Israeli military has taken several of these Palestinian factions. And again, go to that interview from Thursday, Friday, if you want to see more information about this. Several of these Palestinian factions under its wing, allowing them to operate in the areas of the Yellow Line that the military controls. And those airstrikes are actually against Hamas attackers that are trying to challenge those militias. That said, on October 18th, there was also an artillery fire that was reported in the Al-Maghazi refugee camp in central parts of the Gaza Strip. According to Palestinian sources, 11 people were killed. The Israeli military did not report what it targeted there. So there's different reports as to what is actually happening as far as the Israeli military is concerned. The last thing I'll say, a report that came in yesterday is that the Israeli military is now planning to start marking in the Gaza Strip, to deploy checkpoints to mark where the Yellow Line is. That may seem like a small technical aspect, but it is relatively significant because the Yellow Line that the Israeli military is withdrawn to is supposed to be temporary. It's supposed to be just the first phase of the withdrawal until the further withdrawal happens as part of the implementation of phase 2. Now, it is possible that this line will be now drawn, and then there will be a further withdrawal. But the fact that the Israeli military is planning to mark that line, on the one hand, could be said to save Palestinian lives, because instead of an arbitrary line where the Israeli military says you cannot cross, it will be marked. On the other hand, that also has hints of this being more permanent, a more permanent position held for now until the further implementation of phase 2. With that, that's all I wanted to get through. I'm going to quickly review some of the questions that have come in. Let me see what has come in. Sorry, why not just sue for surrender? Someone's asking. I presume you're asking, Krabus, about why not ask for Hamas's surrender. It is possible. I will say that historically, I have studied terror groups around the world. It has not happened. There, out of roughly 4,000 terror groups in the world, maybe one has ever issued an unconditional surrender with regard in response to sole military repression. Very often groups have agreed to some sort of negotiated disarming. But if there would just be a demand for Hamas's surrender, chances are this war will continue indefinitely. Maybe that is what should happen, maybe not. But at this point, that is why it would be at least not part of implementing the deal to ask for Hamas's unconditional surrender. Other questions I am looking at here. Other questions. 7,000, a remarkable number of people saying that Hamas has no force now. Indeed, Hamas is far from defeated. Thank you to those who are saying if you have to go, take care of your family. I do love taking care of my family. Other questions. Why does our unit fill the Telegram? I'm not going to answer to why different Telegram channels do what they do. Social media is not my thing. When do you think they will open new settlement areas that are screened to rule out Hamas from these areas? So, regardless of looking at it as settlement areas, right now, there was a report in the United States that the United States would like to develop Rafah, the southern part of the Gaza Strip that is under complete control of the IDF, to start rebuilding there to make that be a model city, a model Palestinian city of what could happen in an area that's not governed by Hamas. So probably that's going to be the area that most sides actually end up investing in, but remains to be seen if that actually happens. Other questions. The Strip sounds like a bad investment. Well, Trump thinks it's a good investment. If we look a couple months ago, I talked about Trump's economic plan for the Strip. When do you think, questions, since Gaza is basically cut off from the outside world, will a point come when they run out of fighting resources? The Gaza Strip was under strict control and siege of Israel and Egypt from 2005. All of the weaponry that Hamas has, all the weaponry they used on October 7th, thousands, tens of thousands of rockets and missiles, tens of thousands of guns, etc., were all either smuggled in or the majority of them were developed in Gaza. So the idea that just cut Gaza off and eventually they'll run out of weaponry, unfortunately, is actually not something that could be relied on. Other questions I see. I think your child is trying to drop some knowledge. Thank you. Okay, I see there's a few more questions, but I do apologize. I'm hearing my kid going crazy in the other room. So I'm going to sign off now. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Again, I'll say, name's Alon Burstein. I'm a professor of political science. And so people saying they hear my child. Okay, they hear my child singing. I'm a professor of political science and Israel Institute fellow in the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. Feel free to hit that subscribe button. And like I said at the beginning of the video, I am hoping to develop a newsletter soon where I'll be able to actually send out email blasts when I'm going to have these live YouTubes and anything else that may come on live. Thank you all for joining, and thanks for watching.